Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're listening to Fictitious, a podcast about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm joined in this episode by K.Eason, author of How Rory Thorne Destroyed the Multiverse. This charming and subversive fantasy meets space opera tale follows a young princess who is uprooted from her planet and her throne, sent off-world to be a pawn for intergalactic politics. But Rory Thorne is no run-of-the-mill fantasy princess and is definitely no pawn. Gifted at birth with 13 fairy blessings, Rory is smart and beautiful and kind, but most importantly, she can keenly see through flattery and falsehoods. After assassination and war destabilize the galaxy, new political alliances place her under the dominion of the power-hungry Regent that likely killed her father. Accompanied only by 2 trusted and endearing advisors and some surprisingly useful guards, Rory must use all of her wits, gifts, and determination to turn the Regent's plot against him, rescue the mislaid prince she's supposed to be betrothed to, and perhaps avoid plunging the entire star system once again into chaos and conflict. How Rory Thorne Destroyed the Multiverse is a stunningly composed adventure tale that turns storybook tropes on their ear. It's available now from DAW Books. And Kay, welcome to Fictitious.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I got to tell you right off, this is one of the most fun reads that I've encountered in a really long time. At the time of us recording this, I'm about a half to 2/3 of the way through the novel and just absolutely loving every step of it. So I'm really digging this. And in what I'm seeing online when people talk about this, there's a lot of comparisons to, I think the blurb is kind of Princess Bride meets Princess Leia. And I totally get where that's coming from because it definitely kind of has that vibe to it. How would you describe the novel? What is the elevator pitch, or when you're trying to kind of sell it to somebody, how do you describe it?
I mean, that's pretty much the pitch. I think my agent was the one who sent that around to everybody at Princess Leia meets Princess Bride. That was the pitch. Just, hey, this is sort of a combination of sci-fi and fantasy. It's a self-rescuing princess story. It takes fairy tales and puts them in space. Let's go. Also, it kicks the patriarchy in the face. Let's go.
Well, I mean, I think, as far as a short pitch goes, I think that really quickly that establishes the idea in your head where you get the storybook kind of feel and the nature of the narrative. And I want to talk a lot about your prose style a little bit later on in the interview, because I think that's going to be a core component of what people attach themselves to with this story. But as far as just a pitch, when you say, okay, it's Princess Leia-ish kind of character, even though I would say that Rory doesn't bear any distinctive resemblance in the sense that the way she feels in the book, but I can clearly see what those words would mean in describing her. And then it certainly does have that kind of whimsical fairy tale but sardonic kind of feel that The Princess Bride, both the movie everybody knows and the novel everyone should have read, has going for it. So
agreed.
What was the original genesis of this? Where did this initial concept, for this come from for you? And how did you develop that out? Because this is like space opera meets fantasy, with a lot of those 2 different genres layered over on top of each other. So where did that all come from?
It actually started from the Think Geek t-shirt that said Self-Rescuing Princess, that I saw in the catalog and fell in love with and said, I must have this t-shirt. And then I started going on about t-shirts and self-rescuing princesses and how fairy tales suck because the princesses don't get to do anything. And my husband's like, just go write the story then. Okay. So it took me a little while to think about it. And then I thought, well, the fairies can't be wearing those stupid dresses. They've got to be the 13th fairy's got to be a punk. I mean, I love Maleficent. Don't get me wrong. She's awesome. I was like, let's not go with goth. Let's go with punk. And then I thought, well, why not set it in space? Because why not? And then from there, it just sort of took itself off.
And then in the typical storybook fantasy way, off we go. There's, the adventure begins, right?
Pretty much. It was originally supposed to just be a short story, and it was supposed to end around chapter 1. And then I realized the last line of chapter 1 is really not the end of a story, but the beginning of one, and thought, oh crap. I don't know what to do now. I guess I will see what happens with this book. Away we go. I will write this thing. And so that is how Rory Thorne came to be.
And I believe this is intended to be a duology, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that attempt to make a short story didn't work out very well for you.
No, the duology was not planned from the beginning either. That was one of those. I finished it, and then the offer came back and said, could you write a second one? And I was like, yeah, I could do a second one because we're not done with her story. We just had to stop it because at that many pages, we have to stop now. We can't keep
It's
going.
a pretty big book. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I do want to address, like I said, like right off, like the language, the storytelling style, the prose style of it. There's a very specific voice at work here. It's very, at turns, charming and whimsical and wry and sardonic, and has a little bit of a wink at the reader now and then, all of which I immensely enjoyed. And again, it's why you get those sort of like William Goldman kind of comparisons in there. But is that something that's sort of natively your own narrative prose style, or is that something that you were kind of constructing for this book?
It was specifically constructed for this book because I was trying to do the sort of pick up that fairy tale feel. I needed that omniscient third person commentary. And no, this is absolutely not my usual preferred mode.
Did you find it to be a real struggle to stay in that particular voice then? And I mean, is it something that like in the first draft you were already kind of getting it down, or is it something that you really had to labor over to make work over drafts?
It's a weird split. Some places the narrator was so intrusive. I was like, trim that back. Oh my goodness. And then some places, like, where is the narrator? I need the narrator. I need somebody to get this person from one end of the room to the other with, okay, go. So it was weird. It was hot and cold. It was in and out. It was definitely harder. Well, in the action sequences, it gets a little harder to keep them there. But in the early stages, when the world build where the narrator's just describing things, that was ridiculously easy to write because he just goes on and on and on.
Well, you know, something I notice about the narrator and about the story in general, at least like at the point I am in it, it very carefully works its way around most kind of swearing or anything that might be a little lascivious. And again, that's part of the kind of the wink at the reader where it's kind of like, you know what we're saying, you know what's going on in the room here. Maybe Rory at 6 isn't, but she'll get there, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Is that something that, like, to be fair, I stalked your blog and I read your stuff, and I know that at least from reading that, it seems that you're fond of a swear word now and then.
Oh yeah.
So containing yourself in this narrative, was that a challenge?
It was fun. Yeah, it was okay. Because my first 3 books are full of them, full of words. And so this one was, can I write a book without an F-bomb in it? Can I do the straight up PG-13? Can I do it? I think I can do it. So yeah, it was a little bit of a trip to find other ways to express what sometimes you just need that particular word for.
Is there parts in any of the drafts where you just went ahead and let that F-bomb drop somewhere and knowing full well you were going to cut it out later, but almost as a cathartic, like, I'm just going to go ahead and put this in here and then later on remove it?
Nope. This book is clean, completely clean, beginning to end manuscript. There was no F-bomb anywhere. I think there might be a damn in it somewhere. Nothing that can't be played now on network TV.
I know there's a section where one of the characters makes reference to like a pissing contest, and Rory is like sorting their way through, oh, what exactly does that mean? And I think that's as ribald as the language gets in any of those sections.
Well, yeah, because Grit does all of her swearing the narrator tells us she's swearing. And we're like, she's a space marine. Of course she's swearing.
Yeah.
But off screen.
Well, there's a particular device that I like, which is that sometimes the implication that somebody is swearing with immense creativity, stringing words together in an unlikely fashion that would make some blush and some laugh, is almost more powerful than actually just writing that particular string of words. The implication that it is there, and the narrator saying, this is what they did. We're not going to tell you what they said, but just take it to heart. This is it. I think that's really fun, and it works to great effect in many places in this narrative. So like we were saying, this is space opera because there is space travel. A lot of it takes place on a space station, but this is also, there are kingdoms and kings and all of the patriarchal monarchy kinds of stuff that you would expect to have encountered in classic storybook stories. And so you're kind of mashing those things together. And this is a pretty big universe with a lot going on in it. So when you were kind of blending those things together, what was your methodology for building out a universe that is kind of both of those genres of fiction kind of tied together?
Well, the world build was a trip because I thought, okay, assuming an Earth-like origin, this is one nation-state conglomerate that made it into space, and they have this particular governing style, but others must also have gotten there with other particular governing styles. So the patriarchy monarchy is just one version.
Right.
There's corporate conglomerates, and there's matriarchies, and there's just, we don't care. This isn't, in theory, a a meritocracy. They never are, but we like to pretend. So there's pretty much the variety. It was just in order to hit the fairy tale, to hit the patriarchy, I had to go with the monarchy and the archaic nonsense of the heredity laws.
And I think that when you do approach that patriarchal system in there, clearly there's a strong feminist side eye being pointed at all that stuff. But I think even when we look at some of the great storybook kinds of stories and even Disney stuff and whatever, like we do get a pretty firm sense here and there of just how absolutely silly those things are, even if they do still kind of respect the status quo and eventually just try to return to the status quo, which of course is an unfortunate aspect of a lot of the classic storytelling. There's still those moments you look at and you're like, okay, clearly all of this is dumb, right? Yeah. Like that this doesn't work. And all these bylaws and this adherence to tradition and holding on to archaic things because some random person 18 generations back said, this is not how this works. And everybody goes, cool. Okay. Then we're stuck with that forever, I guess. That element is there in this where you're kind of looking at that and playing with it. I think it's hard enough in a story to construct one kind of governing system and make it make sense. But when you've got multiples that are clashing together at one time, like, did you go into this with a sense of like you were going to have to try to make it believable and researched and know exactly how those things were going to work? Or does the storybook aspect of it give you a way to kind of hand wave those things where you can explain just enough to make it work and not have to delve too far into it?
A little bit of both. I mean, if you look at the world and the different ways that governments run themselves and drag up all of the sci-fi and the fantasy and all of the different media that I've consumed over the years, so much media, and the different ways that those systems work. And I thought, well, politics are politics, and people are still trying to get advantage, and people are still trying to get alliance, and people are making deals and figuring out the economies and figuring out trade routes, because space is dark and cold and scary and it will kill you. So we need resources are the major driving feature of this world. Anybody who's off world, even if they're not off world, they have a planet. If they have a planet, they have resources. So resources pretty much drive the economies of all of these different political organizations. It was just this particular one is an old school patriarchal monarchy and they've never had to confront the patriarchy part of it because there haven't been any girl children in all of those years because of the fairies. They sort of made sure that didn't happen. And so in some ways it's, why didn't they confront this sooner? Because they didn't have to. And as we all know, archaic political systems don't change until they're confronted by something that forces them to change. I mean, the British monarchy just recently said that it was ascension could fall to the eldest child, regardless of gender, just like in the last couple years. And they've had scary, powerful queens since Elizabeth, the first Elizabeth. So, I mean, it takes a while. Political drag.
You were talking about there, like you've got the monarchy, but then, and I think it's worth noting what you said there about how like Rory is the first female child born to this royal bloodline in generations. Like you said, there is like some backstory that does get established as far as why that is. But because that has been the case, they've always made boys. So they've never had to run into a situation where they had to question the status quo or actually look at the bylaws any deeper because there weren't any girls there until Rory comes along. So her birth throws a wrench in the works, but it is not by any means the only wrench being thrown, since there is this whole consortium of other planets and systems and trade groups that are kind of coming into conflict here at the beginning of it. And the story has a lot of setup to get through before we get to, I guess, what you would call the inciting incident, before we get to where Rory really gets thrown off world and has all these new challenges in front of her. And I think that's something to address from a craft standpoint is no matter how lovely the writing can be, you still need the opening sequences. If they do take a while to set up, you need to establish them with a lot of quality storytelling and foreshadowing and action and things in order to keep the audience interested. And I think you do that in an excellent fashion here. So when you were putting them together, like you said, originally that first chapter was supposed to be essentially a short story, and instead an entire novel came out of it. How did you work to make that pacing function? How did you make that deliver all that information and keep the story moving and keep the audience interested?
I would have said chapter 2 is actually where it all begins, because that is not too much spoilers. It's chapter 2. That's where the initial assassination of Rory's father happens. And that's where everything tilts. That's where everything starts to go sideways. When I finally got her off the planet, I mean, to me, that's like halfway through, to a third, halfway through, like I had to lay all of that groundwork. Otherwise, that's not the most, I mean, it is an important feature, but it's not the most important feature. I would say the most important thing is that first assassination and that first destabilization. Because once that starts, everything, all the political systems are shaken and everybody starts having to make moves on the board. And even though Rory doesn't really come into play as her own piece, I'm going to lose this chess metaphor at some point, I know it. But she's not a piece yet, but all the other pieces are moving around her. And so if they aren't making the moves, by the time she comes into play, it's not going to matter. She'll never get to play. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So building the groundwork was as much of a world build and building the situation in which she has to grow up. Building the situation a lot in the early stages is more about the adults in the room, because a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old and 8-year-old, yeah, they're great, but they're kids. It's the vizier and the regent consort who are having to make the really hard political decisions that are laying the groundwork for this girl who will grow into a young woman who has to deal with the decisions that her elders made, as we all do. And you grow up in a political system not of your making, not of your choice. So I kind of wanted to get that in the first part of the story of Rory didn't ask for any of this to happen. And of course she didn't. None of us do. But she has to live in it. And so I wanted to show people, hey, this is how it happened. This is how all of these things, the best of intentions, did this or went this way. And Rory's having to reconcile other people making decisions for her, which teenagers hate. And frankly, I hate too. So, I get it. But having to see why they happen, where they happen, and where those lines of tension for Rory were going to happen, but the desire versus duty. So I had to lay that early. I didn't feel like I was waiting to get started. I felt like I have to get this started now with all of these things that are going to come into conflict with her.
And I think there's a sense, at least for me, while Rory is definitely the center of the story, you mentioned the vizier. So there's a guy named Rupert who's one of her advisors. It's her mother's advisor, the king's advisor when he's still alive. And I felt like in the early part of the story, he's really kind of the main character for like maybe the first quarter of the book. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's not the right characterization of it, but certainly he's very center to all the things that are going on. And then there is another character who is the body maid for Rory, who's essentially her bodyguard, her instructor, like on all things sort of physical. And is it Grit?
Grit. Yep.
Yeah. So you have Rupert, you have Grit. And in a lot of ways, I mean, as much as I adore Rory, it's those two characters that I really latch onto in this story. And maybe it's just because I'm growing old and getting gray. And so those characters, like, I feel close to them.
Yeah. I feel like Grit some days, minus the cyber eye. But yeah. But no, you're meant to feel that way because Rory feels that way. They are the world. And so they have to be the world of the narrative as well. Everything comes from and moves around them.
In a lot of stories that revolve around young protagonists, I feel like you get two roles for adults. They are either the sort of Obi-Wan Kenobi mentor that is there for a little bit and then gets axed by necessity so that the person can grow up. Or you get all of the adults are the bad guys and we're in resistance to them until somehow the youths can overthrow or change their minds. And so to have this story where you have Rory, who does have trusted and beloved advisors who are also endearing, I feel like, again, is a little bit of turning some of this stuff on its ear, because instead of her being the one lone person who can see sense in the world, like, she has two people with her that she genuinely can trust and who do have her best interest at heart and who are often conflicting in their own visions with both Rory and each other, but are stalwart companions. And that was really refreshing to me. And again, every scene to get to see through their eyes, whether it's through the sheer exhaustion of the vizier and his trying to manage all the things that are going on, or Grit's, very pragmatic and sardonic way of looking at things and trying to restrain her own need to act, or in some cases restrain her own mirth, because the image that she projects is not of a person of sense of humor. And then she knows it kind of ruins the appearance if it ever shows up. So she's kind of holding those things in reserve because she's aware of the importance of appearance in these political situations. I don't know. I just ate all of that up and I love it so much.
I wanted Rory to have, and I'm a D&D gamer, so that this is important. She needed a group. D&D games don't happen with solo characters very often. You need a group. You need people to help you. And I wanted her to be cooperative, not the lone hero, but the cooperative hero. She needs to be able to forge political and personal relationships. She has to, because that's how you get anywhere. You know, living by yourself in the woods is very tempting. I will not lie, but it's not, it's not going to get anywhere socially or culturally. It's not an option for a princess, period.
Well, and it's fun to watch Rory push and pull against them. I mean, I guess it's important to say that, like, at the point where this book is really off and running, that Rory's about 16. So she's nearing adulthood and is really in this kind of balance between being an exceptionally bright and analytical and often sneaky young adult, but she still has a little bit of youthful tantrum and impulsiveness in there. And also, she is royalty. So in her entire life, she's never experienced certain aspects of confrontation that the average person might. She doesn't come with a lot of lofty arrogance, but she certainly is not prone to letting people convince her not to do what she wants.
Yeah, she is willful.
Yes. And that's a fun dynamic to see. And so, and now you're taking a character like that and then poisoning her against this regent, the Regent Moss, who is essentially the villain of the piece, and who is like very much like the political machinations patriarch guy. What were you building out there as far as having a villain, and how does that reflect on Rory?
Truthfully, I thought, it's fairy tale. I'm flipping it. It's not an evil queen. It's not an evil stepmother. It's not an evil woman. Screw that. It's an evil guy. Let's have an evil guy. Let's have this evil stepfathery figure with 2 sons. Yes, not daughters, sons. So I was doing straight up role flipping. And then I figured out, well, I started thinking about who holds power behind weak leaders, who maneuvers. How might this person get power and hold power? They just have to be really smart and really sneaky and really manipulative and also willing to do the jobs that other people might be too lazy to do. So he has to be smart. He has to be efficient. He has to be kind of like the evil Rory in some ways. He's got to be the perfect ruler, except he's not doing it for the right reasons. He's doing it for power instead of for service.
There's some parallels I thought of in there because in our present age, where we've definitely had some very notable political figures who have totally been either hand puppets or complete blithering idiots with people behind the scenes managing their process in some fashion, whether as a total sycophant or as somebody who is just sort of operating the puppet behind the curtain. So looking at this person as the Regent Moss as essentially worked machinations as a minister within this political group to off the original, or the king at the beginning, not just Rory's father, but another king of this different group, which is what leads to war. And in the process, just kind of quickly goes from a very small position to being an extremely notable person who's positioning himself to take over everything and is pretty interested in monarchy. I mean, there's a nice note about a book that's on his shelf that if Rory had known and noticed would have been very telling about the kind of person that he is, which is a book that's all about the perfection of a royalty, monarchy, theocracy kind of thing, and how there should be no power greater than the king. Which is purely what Moss is going after. So I like that you flipped the script as far as, I didn't even think about the whole, like, instead of having like the 2 evil stepdaughters or whatever, that it's actually the sons in here bickering amongst themselves as well, and how they're all kind of pitted against each other. And then you have this other prince who is the prince from the consortium, or the free worlds, right? So you have a prince who Rory meets in childhood and inadvertently sort of saves him from being killed in the assassination attempt, and who she is supposed to be betrothed through later on, but he's a bit absent. And so, like you said, you've got a self-saving princess who also has a prince that looks like he needs saving. Again, as far as flipping all the script and stuff, like, how were you approaching that?
Just that I thought for once it needed to be the princess who not only saves herself, but also perhaps the prince needs rescuing. Perhaps we just need to keep flipping these tropes, but also bouncing back to medieval romance, which is where we get a lot of these story shapes from, there's always this sense in something like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which I have taught far too often. You have these princes that are these heroes that both must prove their moral worthiness, their courtesy, but also their martial worthiness. And I thought, I don't necessarily want my self-rescuing princess to have to prove her martial worthiness. I want to see if she can do it with the tools that she's got. I mean, she does have grit. Let's all admit that grit may be her martial worthiness. But I thought I wanted to flip it so that she's rescuing the prince using some of the tools of the medieval romance and of the fairy tale, but not necessarily all of them, putting her own sort of spin on it. Some of those princess gifts might be handy, might be useful. They're not a total waste. It's not a waste to be a kind person, or frankly, it's really helpful to be a beautiful person.
Definitely a leg up.
Yeah, definitely a leg up. But what if, if you don't have a magic sword? Well, so effing what? Maybe you don't need a magic sword if you've got something else.
I think the ability to see through lies is definitely a magic sword. That's a +5, I think.
That is
having a really good perception check, right?
Right. And that's exactly it. Like, that's more powerful than the Vorpal sword +20 or whatever. To some, like, I know that there's a few people out there who think, well, that's not a big deal. We can tell when people are lying all the time. Like, can you though? Can you? To always know? And especially if you're a politician or a diplomat, now you really do know what people are thinking all the time. That is both an incredible gift and also an incredible curse. Like, ugh. But also, okay, I got some information, because knowledge is power. And I think here's my inner scholar coming out. I think knowledge is more power. It's nice to have firepower or sword power or whatever, but knowledge is really where it all comes from. Knowing how to use the power that you've got and why you should use the power that you've got.
Right, because that fancy Vorpal sword isn't very useful if you don't know how to swing it.
Yeah, if you don't have a proficiency, disadvantage. Yeah.
We've talked about we mentioned a lot of like D&D magic sword stuff there, but we've talked about like the fairies in this, but there's also a really specific magic system at work in Rory Thorne. It's called Arithmancy. And by its very name, you get a sense that it is mathematics and magic kind of strung together. And it's used very much in tandem with technology in this world. So can you kind of give me an overview of what this magic system is? It's, in a lot of ways, it's failed scientific paradigms.
There's alchemy, and there's all of these different kinds of sciences that didn't work in our particular universe, but do work in Rory's. So it is math as magic. It is layers of ether. We used to posit there were layers of ether. Well, Arithmancy can describe those layers mathematically. Math is the language of the multiverse. Probably actually is the language of the multiverse. And I also stole shamelessly from Pythagoras, A squared, B squared, C squared guy, who was also a mystic. And I thought, a mathematical mystic. Now, there is something that you don't get very much in the post-Enlightenment age. However, why not? Why not? Alchemists were scientists in the Middle Ages, and there were some crazy, cool combinations of science and mysticism. So let's take that and say, what if we didn't have a scientific materialist worldview? What if we had a scientific mysticist worldview? And that's actually how the world worked. Let's go with that.
I've always loved the idea of magic as essentially sort of the operating system language or the code.
Yeah.
It's like it's like being able to see the matrix, as far as being able to just see like the code of the universe and being able to manipulate it. And code is essentially just math, even if it's just in sort of a text form. It's knowing what those if-then statements are, or like how to manipulate the numbers or the CSS coding of the universe in order to make it act and feel like what you want. And Arithmancy seems to have a similar kind of feel for it. But any magic system can cause problems in a story. Like, did you have any places where your development out of that system brought you some headaches, or places where maybe it broke the story for a minute, or your own kind of rules of the story? And then how did you address those problems?
I learned to regret very early on the whole reading auras thing in about a hot second. Yeah. Oh no. Then everybody's got a freaking, oh crap. Then oh God. All right. Colors. And yeah, my beta readers, my agent and I were just mapping color, making sure it was consistent. That was a total nightmare. Making sure all my colors were consistent all the way through. Sometimes I'd just pick a color because it sounded cool. Nope. Nope. There's a rule now. There's a law. You got to go back there and fix that color. Damn it.
Right. Otherwise, you end up with purple lightsabers, right?
Yeah. Oh, don't get me started. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Or metachlorians. Haha. There we go. I took another shot. Metachlorians. But yeah.
Triggering. Yeah.
Triggering. I know, right? Like, oh, need to lie down. But yeah. So that was an issue, and I don't want to go too far up the chain, but there were also places where arithmancy had to expand itself. And I knew it wasn't going to happen in this story, but it was in other places. So when I was working on this book and thinking ahead to the future stories, I was like, how am I going to make these fit? How am I going to make the same laws apply to different effects of arithmancy? Because there's going to be more than just what Rory knows how to do, because she's an 18-year-old girl by the end of it, or not even. So it's got a lot of range and it's got a lot of potential. And I had to try and keep consistent what Rory knew and what the arithmetic advancement of her particular society was versus some of the other ones that I knew were out there. Like some of the Xenos can do stuff. They do different stuff. They see different ways. They perceive different ways. And so their math looks a little different. And so their effects are a little different.
And there's always the challenge when you have a magic system that somewhere in the story, you had a character do a throwaway thing like, oh, hey, I can do this thing, blah, blah, blah. And it fixes a moment. And then deep in the book, you might have another moment where the beta readers or the editors are like, you introduced this big problem, but this guy over here can just make that go away.
Yeah.
Like, oh no. Like, how do you fix that? You know,
you fix that. You just simply go back and rewrite. You figure out which of those moments you need and which one you can fix. And sometimes you do a lot of crying and drinking of coffee or whatever else. And you figure it out. Because, I have had those places in this manuscript and the next one where, oops, crap. Okay, which one do I change? Which one do I fix?
Alex E. Harrow was on the show not too long ago to talk about the 10,000 Doors of January. And she talked about in there where she had a character who essentially learns that she has the ability to sort of write things into existence. Like she has the ability, if she can write something down, she can make it happen. So the second half of the book, she had to do everything in her power to just never let that character have a pen. and she was like, I got into the second half of the book and realized that the Deus Ex Machina power that I had given my lead was incredibly story breaking. So I had to work every moment I could to just contrive not to have that thing in hand, to force her to go through ever increasingly nutty lengths of, if I had to write something, do you prick your finger and write it in blood or something like that? Like, how do you do it? That really sticks with me when I think about the powers introduced into any kind of story, where is there a moment where like, oh, I have to take this, again, our chess piece metaphor, like off the board for a sequence of the book in order for any of this to work? Or how many drafts do I have to go through before I can fix that mechanic? So so I never thought about the aura thing, but that makes a lot of sense, even as a small thing as far as keeping your consistency in place.
And just everybody's emotions are readable all the time. So yikes.
Well, there's even a plant in the story that that certain people have nearby, and it changes colors based on the feelings in the room. Yeah. And I kept thinking that I was like, oh, this would be an immensely useful thing for a person who was trying to read the people around them, but also an intensely embarrassing thing at moments, because if anybody in the room knows what those colors mean, they're like, oh, it's orange. Oh, crap. Things are not good in here.
Right. Exactly. So the little ferns I loved my little ferns because they were my other way of people communicating, but not communicating, because half of this book is things that are not said that are just as necessary, or perhaps more so than the things that are said.
And thinking about the things that are said or not said, we've talked a lot about the narration style, but it's also worth kind of noting that this book is, I would call it third person omniscient-ish, with shifts into limited from time to time. And I tend to be somebody who really likes third person limited. I like things that narrow in on a specific character, at least for a chapter here and there. And this particular novel, and a lot of the places, you really are kind of getting a look behind the scenes from multiple different characters, and you do it very skillfully and very enjoyably. And so kudos to that, because a lot of times people really mangle that. But is that something you had to work hard at to make happen? And is that something where you got it right in the various drafts, or you needed editorial help or beta reader feedback, that kind of thing?
Depended on the scene. It was a challenge. It was always a challenge, because I also prefer to write the super, super limited I like to call it the first person shooter perspective, where you're looking through the eyes and all you know is what that character knows. And the language reflects that character's thinking, and the style of the writing reflects that character's pattern. And so this was really strange to have this omniscient, unifying style and voice throughout, because he's a chronicler. He's writing his history. So I was like, okay, how did Tacitus do it? How did Caesar do it? How did the old chroniclers do it? They editorialized like crazy, but they had a consistent voice throughout. So the trick for me was trying to get the limited feel, even though it's really not limited. It's the narrator imagining or reporting, or in some way spinning out the story of the thought processes of these characters that he apparently knows, but we don't know if he knows.
I think like when you've got, these omniscient viewpoints with characters, I mean, I think like there's that beauty of being able to, like you said, see the unseen or explore the unspoken, which I think is like what kind of the magic power of your narration is in this, where we really get to just understand the characters in a way that the direct dialogue would maybe not give us. And particularly, I know there's moments where like it's the scenes of Grit, where she's watching all these different characters and reading what they're saying, but also what their body is telling her. And then getting that same feedback from her, where like what she's thinking versus what she's trying to project, and playing around with that. And all of that point of view stuff is really fun at play here. To me, I just reading it from the craft's perspective, I kept feeling like, oh my gosh, this reads so fluidly, but God, this had to be difficult.
Yep. You are not wrong.
I guess like what was the function of your editor in this? Like how much help did you get kind of putting that stuff together? Because I really, this is an ambitious novel. It feels like very, very ambitious, and it lands it. So I think that is awesome. But again, like I was just struck over and over again that like nothing that feels this effortless is anywhere near this effortless. So like, what's the team operation on this one?
A lot of it was my first round of beta readers who cheerleaded it. And then my agent, who is a goddess, Lisa Rogers. She is fantastic. And she is my, okay, here are the major holes. So she makes it level up before my editor even sees it. And my editor at DAW is also fantastic. She made a spreadsheet of all she tracked the ages, she tracked the colors, she tracked all of my consistency issues, because at 400 pages, I was like, man, I don't know what's going on. I don't remember what happened on page 30. I mean, are you kidding? That was like a year ago. And no, she was fantastic for keeping it all consistent. I mean, they all were okay. Lisa really hammered on the pacing, because the narrator, as we know, can get a little verbose. And there were places where they were just talking. And she's like, okay, cut this. This is to stop. You need to get to the action sooner, or whatever. So they were really great for making the whole thing come together at the end. The editorial team, they were fantastic.
I feel like if your editorial team is a D&D group, like you need an editor who's a cleric, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That great support and buffing character who can come in and like cast a healing spell. Yeah.
Seriously. And sometimes regrow a limb, like if you've missed a chapter, because, I underwrite most of the time. There's gaps where people will be like, you need a scene here. Oh, I do? Oh, okay. So that's pointing out hey, you're missing a plank on the bridge, and it's a big enough plank that people are going to fall into the river. Maybe you'd like to write that. Oh, okay. So I do.
Well, it is a good person to have on your squad who can point those out and be like, we all fall off the cliff here if you don't fill that in. Mm-hmm. So maybe add something in there. So yeah, that's mighty useful. Do you have a specific plotting method or outlining method that you used with this novel?
No, I'm a pantser on a good day. Some days I'm a flailing blind in the darker. This one, I was usually a half a step ahead of myself, only in the sense of what trope am I going to kick over next? And then how does that play out? And so once I'd kick a trope, I had a little while to figure out how that would shape the world. It's like playing any video game where you're opening the map as you go and you're seeing bits of the map appear. You're like, oh, okay. You know what I mean? Like Borderlands or Dragon Age or whatever, where you're opening the map.
The Fog of War.
Yeah. And as you're looking at your map in the top corner and you're exploring a new level, you see more of the map open up. You're like, oh, I can go into that corner. So writing for me is like that. I'm opening the new map. I don't know where I am. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what's over there. I got to investigate that corner. Nope, that corner is completely worthless. I'm going to come back out of that corner now and erase the last 5 pages. So yeah, that is how this book happened. Most of them happen that way. There's got to be a better way.
As we're recording this, like we're a couple of weeks away from NaNoWriMo season. And I have attempted that a couple of times in the past as a pantser and drove myself into anxiety attacks by attempting to do it that way. Because for me, like pantsing short term feels good. Pantsing long term is a method to madness. And so this year I'm trying that in a completely different approach. So even as you were describing that for the process of writing this book, I was feeling the anxiety flutters. So.
I treat my books like I have a rough idea of what's going to happen, but I usually don't have a really clean idea what's going to happen. It's like a D&D game or teaching in a classroom. You might have a plan, but then it goes to hell in the first 5 minutes because somebody asks a question you didn't anticipate or the character runs off and does something. You're like, what are you doing, PCs? And then you have to just make it up. So for me, that's sort of how I approach my writing is just, okay, I don't know what the characters are going to do. Usually if I try to think about the plot too much, I end up screwing myself up. And I start thinking about these events and I don't think about the people who drive the events. And especially in Rory, it's the people who drive the events. They may also have a plan, but they're the ones driving things and people act or react according to what's in front of them. So for me as a writer, usually my perspective is so limited to the character that I'm seeing what they're seeing. So I am discovering the world along with them a lot of the time. Just, okay, what's happening? What's happening? What's happening? Oh, crap, let's go over there. Oh, crap, let's go over there. What's this? What's this? So to have a big plan, then I feel like, oh, I see the whole maze. I see where the rat's on one side and the snacks on the other side. And I don't know. What's going to make the rat go over there? I don't know. And until I get down on the level of the rat, it doesn't work for me.
So I'm almost scared to ask this question, but what do you write in?
Well, like what? Medium?
Like what software or like, yeah, what medium do you actually write in?
Straight up bog standard Microsoft Word.
Oh God.
Yeah. That's the one I use. Just the word processors, once they appeared on the scene. Back in my day, we didn't have word processors. No, we didn't actually have PCs that were functional until I was in college. Didn't have internet when I was in college. Well, we had BBSs. So yeah, I learned on Microsoft Word many, many, many generations ago, and that's just what I use. It's the only thing I've ever used. It's industry standard. They tell me. So that's what I use.
I only had the reluctant side just because, when you talk about having the go to explore this corner and find, oh, that didn't work and backtracking and eliminating a few pages and stuff and whatever, to me, the idea of like one long linear file like in Word, unless you're breaking it up into chapters and different files in that way. I don't know. There's an author named S.A. Chakrabarty who's magnificent. I adore her, but like she writes that way and she writes these enormous door stopper books in just one massive file in Word. And she's complained before. She's like, my file is choking and I'm running out of RAM and it's like, it can't keep up with my 600-page novel. What do I do? And everybody's like, don't use that because it wasn't designed for that. But again, it's the tool that works for her. Clearly, this is the tool that works for you. And it clearly worked out in the end. So I have total respect for the methodology. Again, I will repress my own anxiety attacks at the phrasing of it, because clearly it was the right weapon in your particular arsenal. But oh my God, it's so scary for me. Okay, this has been a lot of fun. Can you tell me where people should be following your work going forward? You mentioned you have some other books. We know this is a duology, so another one's coming. So where should people be looking for you to keep up with everything that's happening in your writer world?
You can find me on Twitter. I am K.Eason, and my handle is @Svartjager, SVARTJAGR. From the first trilogy of books. That would make sense. And I am at www.mythhistoria.com. That's my blog, which often has cat pictures, but also always has up-to-date publication lists and occasionally appearances if I actually manage to appear somewhere.
I enjoyed reading on the blog about Murder Cat and the new edition Kaiju Cat.
Yeah, Kaiju Kitten. Yeah, my little monster.
Kaiju Kitten, yes. Very entertained by all of that. So, like I said at the top, How Rory Thorne Destroyed the Multiverse is available now from DAW Books. It's an excellent read. I have been enjoying it immensely, so I highly recommend it to everybody. And I would also highly recommend that this is one of those books that slides right into the buy it for gifts in the holiday season, because I think this would make a delightful, if slightly heavy, gift to hand to people, for the people in their life that are looking for a refreshing story that turns tropes on their ear and really has some fun with the patriarchy in a time period where we could really use a little bit more of that fun. So, Kay, I really enjoyed it. I hope people dig it, and thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
Thank you for having me.
This has been episode 15 and the season finale of season 4 of Fictitious. Every episode of the show is available at fictitiouspodcast.com, along with news and events, articles, and more. Listen and subscribe to Fictitious on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, or search for the show using your favorite app. Get connected on Twitter or Instagram, where you'll find us as @FictitiouSpod. You can also chat with me directly on my personal account @HronBusky. If you enjoy Fictitious, please share this episode on your favorite social network, tell your book-loving friends, or write us a review. It all supports the authors who appear on the show, and you'll help me to grow the podcast. This wraps up my season 4. I'm using November to focus on my own novel as part of NaNoWriMo. You'll probably get a bonus episode or 2 from me before the end of the year, but Fictitious will officially return in January of 2020. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. I'm HronBusky. Thanks for listening to Fictitious.